There are moments in life when our words fail us, when explanations crumble, and when our prayers seem to echo back in silence. We want to speak, we want to reason, we want to defend. But God whispers, "Be still." It is in those sacred pauses, in the quietness of the soul, that heaven begins to move. When you stay silent, God speaks not through words, but through wonders. His language is not always spoken in sound, but in signs, not always heard with ears, but seen through miracles. Silence is not weakness. It is not surrender to defeat. It is a declaration of faith that says, "I don't need to speak for myself. My God will speak for me." When you step aside and silence your fears, your anger, and your doubts, you give space for God's hand to work. Miracles often unfold in the stillness we resist. When you stop striving to control outcomes and start trusting God's process, you begin to witness what human strength could never achieve. Think about Moses before the Red Sea. The Israelites were panicking, their enemies were approaching, and the sea blocked their path. Yet Moses said, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." And in that stillness, God parted the waters. It was not in their shouting that the miracle came. It was in their silence, their surrender, their faith. When we are still, God shows that He is still God. Sometimes silence is not about saying nothing, it's about hearing more. When we stop talking, we begin to perceive the divine whispers of guidance that we missed in our noise. Elijah did not find God in the wind, or the fire, or the earthquake, but in the still small voice that followed. That voice speaks when your spirit is quiet enough to listen. There are seasons when people will misunderstand you, when life will accuse you unjustly, when your pain will tempt you to explain yourself. But silence then becomes your shield, because when you remain silent, you allow God to write your vindication. You don't need to argue your case when heaven is already preparing your defense. The miracles that follow are God's response to the words you never spoke. Miracles often need a moment of silence before they arrive. Just as seeds grow beneath the soil unseen, God's wonders are often birthed in hidden places. Your silence is not emptiness, it's expectancy. It's your soul saying, "Lord, I'm waiting for you to speak in your way." When you silence your worry, your miracle begins to form. So if you find yourself in a season of silence, don't mistake it for God's absence. It might be the moment before your breakthrough. Stay still, stay faithful, because when you stay silent, God begins to speak. And when He speaks through miracles that will leave no doubt that He was always listening. Silence invites divine intervention. When you choose to be silent, you are not giving up. You are stepping aside to let God step in. There are times when your words, your arguments, and your efforts only make the storm louder. But when you quiet your spirit and stop striving in your own strength, heaven begins to move. God does not need noise to work. He moves most powerfully in the stillness of faith. Silence becomes an act of surrender, a sacred space where the natural makes way for the supernatural. It is where you stop trying to make sense of things and start trusting that God's unseen hand is already arranging what your eyes cannot see. In that quiet surrender, divine intervention begins. When you stop speaking out of frustration, fear, or doubt, you create room for God to speak and act on your behalf. Your silence becomes an invitation for the miraculous. Many times we drown out the gentle voice of God with our constant worry and explanations. We want to fix things, justify ourselves, and prove our worth. But miracles often wait for the moment we stop trying to control them. God cannot fill what is already full, and when your mind and mouth are full of noise, there is no room for His whisper. Silence empties the heart of chaos, making space for divine direction and power to flow freely. It is in that inner calm that God performs the work only He can do. Throughout Scripture, silence has been a precursor to divine action. Before God parted the Red Sea, He told the Israelites to be still. Before Joshua's shout brought down the walls of Jericho, the people marched in silence for 6 days. Before Jesus calmed the storm, there was a sacred stillness that preceded His command. In every instance, human silence allowed divine power to manifest. This pattern shows us that when we step back, God steps forward. When we refuse to let panic drive our words, we make space for faith to lead our miracles. Silence also expresses deep trust. It is saying, "Lord, I believe that you can handle what I cannot." It is acknowledging that your human understanding is limited, but His wisdom is infinite. When you choose silence, you are declaring that your hope is not in your ability to explain, but in God's ability to intervene. This act of faith moves heaven because it shows dependence. It tells God, "I'm not fighting this battle with words. I'm giving it to you." And when you hand your situation to Him, He begins to shape outcomes beyond your imagination. Many of the greatest miracles in life happen when you stop striving and start surrendering. God's intervention doesn't always arrive with thunder or spectacle. It often comes quietly, transforming situations in ways that defy logic. The silence that feels like nothing is happening is often the silence of heaven preparing something extraordinary. So, when you stay silent in faith, you are not abandoned, you are surrounded by divine activity. Your silence becomes the stage upon which God performs His miracles. Stillness is an act of faith. When you choose to remain calm in the midst of chaos, you are silently declaring that you believe God is in control. The human instinct is to react, to rush, to fix things immediately, but faith whispers, "Be still." Stillness is not the absence of action, it is the presence of trust. It is saying, "I don't need to panic because I know who holds my life." When everything around you shakes, stillness becomes your testimony that your confidence is not in circumstances, but in the unchanging power of God. It is in the quiet posture of faith that miracles begin to form. The storm may rage, but when your heart is still, you are positioned to see God's hand move. In moments of trial, stillness often feels unnatural. Your emotions push you to speak, to argue, to demand answers. Yet, true faith stands quietly, knowing that what God can do in one moment of stillness is far greater than what you could accomplish in a lifetime of striving. Stillness doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing the most powerful thing possible, waiting in peace. It is in this waiting that God begins to align things in your favor. Your stillness becomes the evidence that you trust His timing. When you hold your peace, heaven begins to fight your battles. The Bible reminds us in Psalm 46, 10. Be still and know that I am God. This is not a gentle suggestion, it is a divine instruction. God calls us to stillness so that we may experience His sovereignty. When you are still, you acknowledge His authority over your life. You admit that your plans are limited, but His are perfect. Think of Moses standing before the Red Sea. The people were terrified, the enemy was near, and the waters blocked their escape. Yet Moses declared, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." That stillness was not weakness, it was power. It was a declaration that God's strength was about to be revealed. Stillness also brings spiritual clarity. When you stop fighting, you start hearing. God often speaks in the silence after your surrender. In the noise of fear and anxiety, His voice is drowned out, but in stillness, His direction becomes clear. Many miss divine instruction because they are too busy trying to make things happen on their own. Faithful stillness tunes your heart to heaven's frequency. It opens your eyes to see what God is doing behind the scenes. You may not understand it in the moment, but when you choose peace over panic, you give God permission to reveal His purpose in His time. There is a quiet strength in those who wait on God without complaint. Their calmness confuses the enemy because it shows unshakable trust. The devil expects you to fear, but when you remain still, you show that your confidence is not built on circumstances, it's anchored in Christ. Stillness is faith that breathes without words. It is hope that stands unshaken. When you choose to be still, you are not standing in defeat. You are standing in expectation, knowing that God is about to turn your silence into a miracle. God's voice is heard in quietness. In the noise of life, we often miss the gentle whispers of His guidance because our hearts are crowded with distractions, worries, and opinions. Silence becomes sacred when we intentionally quiet ourselves to listen to Him. God rarely shouts over the chaos. Instead, He speaks softly, inviting us into stillness where revelation flows. The world teaches us to fill every moment with sound, activity, and talk, but the Spirit of God moves in the calm, not in the clamor. When we learn to be quiet before Him, our spiritual ears open to frequencies we could not hear before. It is in the hush of the soul that divine wisdom descends, and the peace of God begins to speak louder than any noise around us. When Elijah sought God on Mount Horeb, he encountered wind. You give yourself the power to move forward with confidence and clarity, and fire. But God was not in any of them. Then came a gentle whisper, and in that whisper was the presence of the Almighty. That moment teaches us that God's voice is not found in external drama, but in internal peace. The gentle whisper represents intimacy. It requires closeness to hear. When you are quiet before God, you draw near enough to hear the soft tones of His Spirit guiding you. Many people seek a loud sign or a thunderous answer, but often the miracle of direction comes through the still small voice within the heart that says, "This is the way, walk in it." Quietness before God is a discipline of the Spirit. It requires trust to stop speaking and start listening. We are quick to pray, to ask, to tell God what we want, but true communion includes listening. Listening is an act of humility that acknowledges that God knows more than we do. When you quiet your thoughts, you allow Him to replace confusion with clarity. His voice brings peace, not pressure. When you hear Him, you stop striving and start aligning. His words do not rush you, they steady you. His voice cuts through the noise of fear and doubt and brings a calm assurance that you are not alone. There are moments when God's silence itself becomes His message. When He is quiet, He may be teaching you to listen deeper, to trust longer, to believe stronger. His silence is not absence, it's preparation. The quiet seasons are where faith matures. They train your spirit to depend on His unseen presence rather than on constant confirmation. In that stillness, God shapes your heart, molds your perspective, and deepens your discernment. What feels like divine silence may be the echo of His wisdom, waiting to unfold in its appointed time. In quietness, you hear the rhythm of God's grace. Every breath becomes a reminder that He is near. You begin to sense His guidance, not through thunder, but through peace. The voice of God is not heard by the restless, but by the restful. When your heart finally grows still, heaven begins to speak clearly. The miracle is not always in the noise of deliverance, but in the calm of revelation. God's whisper is powerful enough to move mountains in your spirit without ever raising His voice. Silence protects your spirit. When you choose to remain silent instead of reacting to negativity, you are not showing weakness, you are showing wisdom. Every word you speak carries power, and when spoken in anger, frustration, or fear, those words can wound your own peace. Silence becomes a spiritual shield that guards your heart from the arrows of conflict, gossip, and misunderstanding. It is the discipline of not allowing external noise to disturb your internal calm. When you hold your tongue, you keep your peace, and when you keep your peace, you remain connected to the presence of God. Silence gives you space to hear His guidance before responding and prevents the enemy from using your emotions as weapons against you. In moments of confrontation or accusation, silence becomes your greatest strength. Jesus Himself demonstrated this truth. When He stood before Pilate, surrounded by false witnesses and mockers, He did not defend Himself. Though He had the right and the power to speak, He chose silence. His silence spoke louder than any argument could. It showed confidence in the Father's plan and trust in divine justice. Likewise, when we stay silent in times of false judgment or misunderstanding, we are not ignoring the situation. We are inviting God to be our defender. Every time you refrain from explaining yourself, you are saying, "Lord, I trust you to speak for me." Silence in this sense becomes an expression of faith and maturity. Silence also protects you from regret. Words spoken in haste can never be taken back. They can burn bridges, hurt loved ones, and create unnecessary battles. The wise learn that not every situation deserves a response, and not every accusation requires an answer. Proverbs reminds us that even a fool is thought wise if he keeps silent. Choosing silence allows your emotions to settle before you act, giving God the opportunity to guide your next step. Many conflicts could be avoided if silence were chosen over reaction. When you stay silent, you give time for truth to reveal itself naturally, and in that stillness you preserve your spiritual strength. Furthermore, silence protects the purity of your heart. When you stop engaging in arguments, negativity loses its grip. Silence frees you from the need to prove your worth or justify your faith to those who do not understand it. It keeps your focus on God rather than on the opinions of others. In that protected space of quietness, you can hear God reminding you who you are, His child, His creation, His chosen one. The more you practice silence, the stronger your spirit becomes, because you no longer react to every noise that tries to steal your peace. When you choose silence, you are not being passive. You are actively protecting your anointing. You are setting boundaries between what matters and what distracts. The peace of God is fragile in a noisy soul, but silence preserves it. So stay quiet when the world provokes you, for your silence is not emptiness. It is armor. It is the sacred covering that keeps your spirit safe until God's voice brings the answer. Miracles are born in hidden places. God often works in silence, in the unseen moments when no one is watching and no one applauds. The greatest transformations take place not under bright lights, but in the quiet darkness where faith is tested and patience is refined. Just like a seed buried beneath the soil, miracles begin in obscurity. You may not see any movement, you may not feel any progress, but deep beneath the surface, something divine is unfolding. God does His most extraordinary work in secret, shaping outcomes beyond your understanding. The hidden seasons of silence are not wasted. They are where God prepares the foundation for His visible glory. When life feels still and uneventful, it is easy to think that nothing is happening. But just as a seed must die before it grows, your silence and surrender are part of a sacred process. God conceals His work until it's ready to be revealed, so that when the miracle finally appears, it carries the full weight of His glory. You may be in a season where your prayers seem unanswered, your dreams seem delayed, and your progress seems invisible. Yet, in that hidden space, God is aligning people, circumstances, and opportunities in ways you cannot yet see. Every moment of waiting, every tear, every prayer in silence is a seed sown for a future miracle. Consider how Jesus performed His first miracle at the wedding in Cana. The transformation of water into wine didn't happen before the crowd. It happened in the jars, hidden from view. The servants who obeyed His instruction witnessed the process before anyone else. In the same way, God often performs His miracles in the private corners of your life, long before the world sees the result. By the time others notice, the miracle has already matured in silence. This teaches us that the hidden work of God is not less powerful. It is simply unseen until the appointed time. The hidden season is also a season of preparation. Before David became king, he was anointed in secret and spent years tending sheep. Before Joseph became a ruler, he was forgotten in a prison. Before Jesus began his public ministry, he spent time in solitude and fasting. Each of these moments of silence and hiddenness was part of divine preparation. God was shaping their character, refining their hearts, and preparing them for the miracle of destiny. Your silence may not be a punishment. It may be your preparation for something greater. When God hides you, it's because He's growing something sacred within you. Hidden miracles require quiet faith. They don't demand visibility, they demand trust. You may not understand it now, but one day you'll see that the silence was not God's neglect, it was His nurturing. Just like the seed breaks through the soil in due season, your miracle will rise from the hidden place in God's perfect time. What begins unseen will one day be undeniable, for every silent preparation ends in a visible manifestation of God's glory. Silence precedes breakthrough. Before every great move of God, there is a pause, a quiet space where nothing seems to happen, yet everything is being set into motion. This silence is not emptiness, it is expectancy. It is the calm before the dawn, the stillness before the storm of blessings. God often works in silence because He wants you to rely on faith, not on sight. The waiting, the quiet, the uncertainty, these are not signs of abandonment, but preparation for transformation. Just as night comes before sunrise, silence always comes before breakthrough. It is in those still moments that God arranges what eyes cannot see and hearts cannot yet comprehend. When you face seasons of silence, it is tempting to believe that God has forgotten you. Prayers seem unanswered, doors remain closed, and time feels motionless. Yet, heaven's silence is often a sign that something powerful is about to unfold. Before Lazarus walked out of the tomb, there were 3 days of silence. Before the walls of Jericho fell, there were 6 days of silent marching. Before Jesus rose from the dead, there was a silent tomb. Every miracle is born in the space between prayer and manifestation, between the cry and the response. The silence before breakthrough is where faith is tested and refined. It is where trust matures and dependence on God deepens. Silence is God's way of strengthening your spirit for the blessing to come. If He answered too soon, your faith might remain shallow. If He stayed too long, your heart might faint. But in His perfect timing, silence becomes the soil where endurance grows. Waiting in silence teaches you to hold on to promises even when there are no visible signs. It transforms impatience into worship and worry into expectation. Every second of silence is God building spiritual muscles within you, so that when the breakthrough arrives, you are ready to handle it with grace. In the silence before breakthrough, God often removes distractions and reveals motives. He uses the stillness to separate you from noise, from opinions, and from false attachments. It is in the quiet place that your heart realigns with His will. You begin to see that the delay was not denial, it was direction. God doesn't want to just bless you. He wants to prepare you to sustain the blessing. The silence gives Him room to shape your character and purify your faith. What feels like a pause is often divine precision. When your life grows quiet, don't despise it, embrace it. Because every miracle story begins in stillness, the silence is God's strategy, not His absence. The enemy may whisper that nothing is happening, but the truth is, heaven is moving behind the scenes. Your silence is the final stretch before the shift, the deep breath before the breakthrough. Stay still, stay faithful, and soon the silence will break with the sound of answered prayers, open doors, and fulfilled promises. God's timing never fails, and His silence always ends in glory.